Hi, this is Jens Soering, and I spent 33 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. And if that weren't bad enough, after my release, the media started telling lies about me. And by the media, I mean Netflix, but also German public TV. And today, I'm going to try to address in this video one of the, in my opinion, lies told about this case by the media and also at my trial. And that's about this theory or accusation that I had injuries directly after Derek and Nancy Haysom were murdered. There's somebody who looked at this accusation very closely in 2017, and that is Sheriff Chip Harding, who's with us today. And Chip, would you introduce yourself again for the viewers?
Sure. I've been retired about 4 years, spending my time doing a lot of fly fishing and enjoying life. But prior to that, I spent 50 years of my career in the Virginia justice system as a probation officer and 30 years overseeing investigations in the city of Charlottesville, and also running a DEA task force, being sworn in as a special federal agent for a while. My last 12 years, I was the elected sheriff of Albemarle County that surrounds the city of Charlottesville, got about 120,000 population.
At my trial, there was one single witness who said that he saw injuries on me, black eye and bandages on my hands. Nobody else saw this. Only Donald Harrington says he saw this, and he testified about it at my trial. And if this were true, this would be damning evidence, although you can't really know whether it was from the crime. It might have had another cause, but it's certainly very incriminating evidence. And what happened when you were investigating this case in 2017, 2018, who asked you to look at Donald Harrington?
Well, when I was going through the case, I read that testimony, and I knew that you had said something like in your false confession that Derek Haysom had hit you in the face and that you'd also cut your hand. And so convenient that Mr. Harrington, a respectable business owner and whose family, when I started investigating, his family couldn't have been any nicer in trying to help me. Anyway, it seemed highly suspect that he would say that he noticed, was on the steps looking down and noticed that Jens Soering had a bruise on his face as if hit by a right cross and a bandaged fingers or hand. Said, isn't that convenient? That fits right in to what you'd said in your false confession. So before I put a lot of time invested in it, it was another test on you. I told you, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to investigate this. So you tell me right now, before I spend all these hours in traveling, did you have a cut hand? It may have been another reason. If you did, give me the reason right now. And you said, absolutely not. And I would like for you to talk to this person, this person, this person, this person, and anybody else you can find. So you gave me some leads. So from that, Richard and I ran down Mrs. Harrington. It turned out she was severe memory decline. She couldn't remember anything, really, other than she was in an art group and really good friends with Nancy Haysom's best friend, and knew Nancy Haysom, and the Harringtons, and that, I don't want to call it elite, but status. Every small community has it. They seem to go in the same circles and were friends with each other. But that's all we got. And the son, who couldn't have been a nicer guy, helping me with his mom and everything, he didn't know anything about it. I was able to, from the leads you gave me, leads I cultivated through the University of Virginia, form a list of people that were your sweet dorm mates and her sweet dorm mates. And not to pat myself on the back, but it takes a long time to try to run people down. The names changes. They don't, you don't know the phone numbers and all that. Well, I was able to run down maybe about 75% of them. And I would say a third of them were just mad that I got in touch with them. Want to know, how did I know what I knew? I'd say, well, it's a lot of stuff on the internet. I never told them everything. And they'd hang the phone up. I don't want anything to do with this case, and blah, blah, blah. But then I hit some people. I hit a gentleman that had dinner with the two of you all, I believe, even before the bodies had been found.
Yes, that's exactly right.
That's right. And he told me where, the restaurant on UVA grounds, and he'd spent a couple of hours with you all and had been around with you other times. And I look back at an alibi that had been written out by Christine Kim. It was supposedly, according to Elizabeth, dictated to her by you and her. You say absolutely not. And that's one of the things you really pressed us hard to try to get Christine Kim to talk to us. And she refused to ever respond to anything, to anybody. But at any rate, I looked at that alibi that had been written out, supposedly showing where everybody was during like a 3-day period. And sure enough, where the now doctor told me he had dinner with you two is in the alibi.
There's written confirmation that this person who back then was living in a dorm suite with me,
Right.
and he is now a surgeon in another state. I don't want to name the state, but he's a surgeon in another state near Virginia. And
he told me absolutely not. He was 100% sure, and he definitely would have noticed it, particularly since it had been this homicide. It would have really kind of jumped out at him. Absolutely not. And he was willing. He never wanted to do anything in the media about it, but he agreed to be interviewed by the state parole/pardon investigators. And I gave them the document of what he told me, and I feel certain they would have called him. I don't know, but I feel like they would have. But he was willing, knowing that was going to go to the governor. Then I found a woman who's a lawyer now, who knew you very well.
yes,
She was one of the women that actually went and found you and Elizabeth at a movie when they were coming to break the news that her parents had been murdered. And she said, absolutely no bruise or bandage on your hand. All right, so we set that where that is. That's pretty compelling. In talking to Chuck Reed said anytime there was a lead developed on the case, you were required to write something up. There was never anything found that would support anything was ever written up.
Can I briefly ask about that? That is standard police procedure, right?
Yeah, particularly in a case like this was considered a task force case, and they had people well above the investigators that would be sending leads and keeping files. Well, on top of that, Chuck Reed said he was working alongside Ricky Gardner, and Ricky Gardner never ever mentioned it to him, and that you weren't even a suspect at that point. So that's highly suspect. What else normal police procedure would be, if you were concerned enough to make that phone call, you would go find you and photograph those injuries and have them available for court. That was never done. So now today it leaves me, and I'm not going to say anything put me where I have to represent myself in a defamation case here. So I'm going to say let the viewer judge for themselves. But I can tell you it leaves me wondering, I'm not saying by any means that a Commonwealth attorney would allow to knowingly let somebody perjure themselves, because that's friggin' huge to allow that.
Well, I can tell you this. As far as defamation is concerned, Donald Harrington, you cannot sue somebody for defamation after that person is deceased. That's not a risk. The question is whether the prosecutor knew about this. And that prosecutor is now the judge. And we're not saying anything about that prosecutor who is now the judge. We're not even going to say his name. It is certainly suspicious. And there's a couple of other things I want to bring up in this regard. Chuck Reed, who I'm also speaking with, and who's done a report on this case now, said that when he reached out to me, it was the first time in September. And then he interrogated me about a week later on October 5th. And there's a transcript of that interrogation. And never once in that interrogation does anybody ask me, hey, Mr. Soering, what about those injuries on you at the funeral service? How do you explain those? It never gets mentioned. And then Elizabeth and I left the country, and like 5 months later, we get arrested in England, and then we get interrogated there. And again, Ricky Gardner is in England interrogating me. And he never once, for 4 entire days, he never asks me, hey, Jens, in addition to everything else we think we know about you, we also got a witness saying that you had black-eye injuries on your hands. You want to tell us about that, Jens?
Right.
Isn't that strange? Is that not weird?
And you've got folks from the family that around you at the funeral and everything, and none of them are called to corroborate, but yet he calls someone who apparently has good standing in the community who comes up with this story. And Richard and I liked the family so much, we were trying to find an excuse for it. Like, maybe, this is all speculation I'm getting into now, is he and I talking back and forth. Well, maybe they were good friends with the Haysoms. Maybe they got a phone call and said, hey, you know, we need help on this case. Did you happen to see he had a cut hand and a bruise? Because they knew whoever did it could have. And maybe they planted that imagery in his mind to the point he believed it at the I don't know.
I have some theories about that, but before I get to those theories, I want to throw something else out at you. At my trial, Christine Kim did not have to testify. She gave written testimony, stipulated testimony. That's very unusual, and it never gets mentioned by anybody because people try to ignore the truth. But in her stipulated testimony, she said that, number one, she wrote that alibi timeline that you're talking about, but she cannot remember whether it was just Elizabeth and she or Elizabeth and me plus she. It's her handwriting, no doubt, but she cannot remember who was there. And the other thing that this Donald Harrington character said in his testimony, that he saw me with these injuries standing next to Christine Kim. That's what he said in his testimony. And then she says in her stipulated testimony that she cannot remember whether or not I had injuries. And we spent the entire week together, many hours each day. And she says she cannot remember either way.
Yeah. Christine, in interviewing some of the folks when I was looking for the injury stuff, she was portrayed as a very nice person who was basically just crushed when you all took off. And I always wondered if Elizabeth ever confided the truth in her, but Christine is completely, she will have no contact. Multiple people will try to contact her. She'll have no contact and talk. And it kind of shocks me that someone that goes on and has got a PhD and is now a professor in a college in our country can't remember something as traumatic that surrounded that terrible murder within 5 years of the murder.
It reminds me a little bit of people who are called for congressional hearings and they're being grilled by all the senators. Senator, I cannot recall. I guess it's possible that she cannot remember, but the really weird thing is this alibi timeline was shown at court, but it was not introduced into evidence. And I actually have the physical Christine Kim alibi timeline myself. It ended up in my papers. I've got it sitting here in my bedroom.
The original?
The original, in her handwriting, because it was not introduced into evidence. They talked about it, but they didn't introduce it into evidence. And somehow it ended up on my lawyer's desk. And now, 40 years later, it's in my bedroom. I've got the actual Christine Kim alibi timeline.
Crazy.
And it's 3.5 pages long. And the idea that you cannot remember who was sitting in the room with you writing that thing is strange. It's strange.
It is.
And then you were asking about why would Donald Harrington lie? Because he did lie. I have a theory about that. At Elizabeth Haysom's sentencing hearing in 1987, Annie Massey, Nancy Haysom's, that's the mother of Elizabeth Haysom, Annie Massey, the mother's best friend, testified that the mother took nude photographs of her daughter, Elizabeth, and that she showed them around to her friends, and that they were for art. That's in the trial transcript. That's not a secret. And there you go. And in your interview with Donald Harrington's widow, I think her name is Patricia Harrington, she said that she was in this artist group. Maybe Patricia Harrington knew something about what was going on between Nancy and Elizabeth. And this came out in the Netflix series. That's the one good thing they did in the Netflix series. They brought up the fact that Elizabeth was very likely sexually abused by her mother. And maybe because she was in that group with Nancy Haysom and Annie Massey, that artists group, maybe she knew something and felt that the public should not find out about that. And maybe that's the reason why her husband then decided to point the finger at me, because that was one way to make sure that these, let's say, dirty secrets didn't come out. There's a scene in that other movie got taken off the market where the judge in the case, William Sweeney, is talking to his wife, and his wife starts talking about the sexual abuse. And the judge says, "No, we don't want to talk about that. Just stop talking about that," right? And you remember that scene, right?
Did you ever tell my client that Mrs. Massey had somehow done things to you?
Objection, Your Honor.
I apologize that I have to do it, but I feel that it's my duty. Did you ever tell Jens Soering that your mother's good friend, Mrs. Massey, touched you in any way?
Yes, she did.
When you ask a question like that, you've got to prove it. You can't just ask questions and then not back it up with proof. Now, so far, you haven't backed it up with proof. And if you don't, I'm going to strike the question and I'm going to strike the answer.
She admitted it.
You think you have other evidence on that? Well, go ahead. I'll give you a chance.
Did you ever tell Jens that Mrs. Massey knew about these photographs? And that you just sort of tweaked my breast and said, those photographs are just lovely, and I was very embarrassed. You say that?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't true, was it?
I'm afraid it is, sir.
You're saying here today that she knew about the photographs?
As far as I know, yes, she did.
There were rumors that there were...
No, I just don't think we ought to talk about the rumors, honey. I mean, really, I don't think that adds anything to it.
None of them were true.
Well, I know that.
All kinds of
Because
rumors.
that might involve other people, and I just don't think we ought to go into that.
What I'm saying is there's secrets being kept in that town. And maybe Donald Harrington's testimony against me was a way to stop those secrets from getting out.
Yeah, I mean, he could be. And then he might feel like, well, he's guilty. I just need to help them.
Put him away.
I'm not doing anything bad because the dude's guilty anyway. He's German. Who likes the Germans in Bedford? But when you mention that, but cutting it off, something else that seemed like they kind of cut off really quickly is when you said before Elizabeth left, she got a phone call and said, I've got to take these drugs to Charlottesville. Who do you think the phone call was from? And you said, he told me it was from Jim Farmer, who was her supplier. Well, it seemed like they didn't want anything talked about either when I watched different excerpts. It's almost like, what do you put the judge's son into this? Because Mr. Farmer, judge, and
you're right that they're always trying to keep Jim Farmer out of this because he's the judge's son, I assume. But there's a key thing about this case that keeps getting overlooked. Jim Farmer's 20th birthday party was on March 30th, 1985. The night of the murders, Jim Farmer was celebrating his 20th birthday. And he was celebrating it in Lynchburg, just a couple of miles, 3 or 4 miles away from the Haysom residence. What would make more sense for somebody who says that she's a drug addict? Elizabeth said she was a drug addict. What would make more sense than for Elizabeth to want to go to a party where her own supplier is celebrating his 20th birthday? There's probably free drugs going around, and it's just a few miles, 3 or 4 miles from her parents' house. Something, my belief, I'll go to my grave believing this, something happened at that birthday party of Jim Farmer's. I don't know whether it was him involved. I'm just saying it would make sense for her to go to that party to score some free drugs, and then just 3 or 4 miles away from this druggy party, 2 people get murdered in a horrible way that suggests drug involvement, because you look at how terribly these poor people were murdered. That looks like a junkie crime.
I would say it could be. I found it interesting. They were downplaying like you were being a bad person for even bringing his name up. Jim Farmer, a drug dealer? Are you kidding me? I actually found a guy that was a housemate with Farmer after they graduated, and he said Jim was a drug user, but I never knew him to be a dealer. And I said, well, isn't it interesting that when I ran a criminal history, it popped up in the state of Washington, and I contacted that police department. I'm not going to call the name of it. And they were very cooperative and sent me copies of arrest reports where they stopped Farmer in a shopping complex. And in his vehicle, he had heroin, cocaine, marijuana, set of scales, and cash in the trunk of his vehicle.
That's the first I've ever heard of this.
Yeah, that was 20 some years later. So here we got Soering saying, she said, I'm going to meet my supplier, Jim Farmer. And back then, everybody's going, well, that's a bunch of baloney because Jim's the son of a judge. Well, Soering making this crap up to save his own behind. Well, here we fast forward. I can look today. I've got the reports in my file down in the basement. There's the arrest report. Well, he's got all this stuff. I worked in the drug unit for 10 years. It sure sounds like a drug dealer to me.
So he's got at least 4 different kinds of drugs and a set of scales in his car.
And cash.
Yeah. And cash.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a dealer to me, which supports what I've been saying all along.
Yeah. And see, that to me corroborates what you were saying back then. When people ask me, well, who do you believe? Well, I think Jens stayed behind. I think Jens is guilty of being accessory after the fact, and you wouldn't have got, I think, a year at the time. But Jens got it right on the movie tickets, and they were in his possession in his room. Jens got it right on the room service. Jens got it right on Jim Farmer being a drug dealer, that no one else apparently was aware of it. You are only aware of it, I assume, because Elizabeth told you that. So you start adding all that stuff up, and then you look at her saying you show up covered in blood, which we know couldn't have happened it's very slim probability it happened like that. And then the stuff you got wrong by saying you were there, my conclusion is feel pretty strongly that you stayed behind and she was there with someone else.
You wanted to say a couple of other things about Elizabeth.
We talked about what I would call a confession over in England, where the investigator, who you could tell must have been very tunnel vision that you did it, and this pretty little girl couldn't have heard her parents. I'm thinking that's what he was thinking. Detective says, you knew he was about to do this, meaning you, and she says, I did it myself. That's all recorded. And he goes, that's silly. She goes, I got off on it, which I could see that. And then he goes, well, what does this mean? And she goes, oh, I'm just being facetious. I have never heard of an interrogation going like when somebody is confessing, you stop and tell them they're being silly, and maybe it brings them back into reality.
Here's the thing that bothers me about that episode. At the time she says that, I did it myself, I got off on it. What they had was her blood type, not DNA, just blood type, but still her blood type near her mother's body. They got a shoe print that is her shoe size.
Right.
They got cigarette butts that is her brand at the front door and the back door. They got her fingerprints on a vodka bottle, and her father and her mother both have elevated blood alcohol content.
Right.
And they know that she's got a really good motive, which is the nude photographs and the allegation that her mother sexually abused her. And there is the FBI profile where Ed Sulzbach says it's a woman in a close relationship to the family. You have all of this stuff, and then you have a female suspect saying to you, I did it myself, I got off on it. And instead of them saying, please tell me more, they say, you're being silly, tell us the truth. I think that's just absolutely crazy bizarre.
Yeah, it is. I think I would have said, when she said that, I would say, well, do you think the drugs contributed to it? Do you think it's really the fault of the drugs? I would start a theme development going, you're a good person, but when you ingest these type of drugs, they can make you a different person. You're probably sorry you did this, that you caused this to happen, aren't you? I mean, looking back, don't you think it was, you know what I mean? To give
make it easier. You would have made it easier for her to confess.
Yeah, you don't go, that's silly. Get back to her. Now, she told you she did it, and she was going to meet Jim Farmer, that we now know that Farmer looks like he was a drug dealer 20 some years later. We know that the original suspect gave a statement that she looked at her in the beginning of the case and said, I'm the devil and you're my sacrificial lamb, when everyone thought that girl might get arrested.
That's Mary.
Yeah, Mary. And then at her birthday party that was thrown just a few days, two of the girls I interviewed that had been suite mates said, we might even have a picture of her with it, but they sent me a picture of her, but she didn't have the knife in her hand. Said, we gave her a birthday cake. We felt sorry for her parents being killed and handed her a butcher knife to cut the cake. There's about 8 of us in the room. And she raised the knife up like she's going to stab one of us, scared the crap out of us, and then put the knife down, started laughing, went on, cut the cake. I mean,
this was back at college a few days later.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, of course, there's also this letter that the prosecutor back then, who is now the judge, it's kind of slimy, frankly. It's kind of a freaky letter where he's writing her in 1991, what a wonderful person she is. And he's so sorry. He's always glad to hear from her. You've read the letter, right?
I so look forward to hearing from you. I've never heard of a prosecutor going back and forth with a nice looking, attractive murderer in that fashion.
And then at the parole hearing, he says she's so charming and fascinating. If you read the letter and then you read the article about the parole hearing, what you come away with is the feeling that the prosecutor back then, who is now a judge, was kind of sweet on her.
Yeah, you can say that. I'm not saying it. I mean, that's the feeling you got. It might be the feeling I got. I'm not going to say it though. He's still a circuit court judge and he's not that far away from me. So.
And now for a brief commercial interruption. I fought for justice for 33 years while I was in prison, and I'm still fighting for justice today, after my release, through these videos and through a new pardon petition. There's a method to my madness. In prison, I developed a 7-step program for developing fighting spirit so that I would never, ever, ever give up. Today, I work as a coach, and I teach my clients how to develop that fighting spirit as well. Most of my clients come to me because of issues like career development, toxic relationships, libel, or defamation. But of course, I adapt my program to whatever my clients' needs are. If you're interested in working with me as a coach, please go to my website. I'll check you out there.
One of the things that has been said about me is that, especially in the media after my release, that I somehow manipulated you and Richard, and that I somehow only gave you certain documents, but not the complete record. And I just want to get this out here. Did I manipulate you? That's the first question. And the second question is, didn't you and Richard go to the courthouse and the evidence locker and actually check up on everything and got your own evidence? Not just the stuff that Steve Rosenfield and I gave you, but you checked on everything yourself at the courthouse and at the police department, right?
So the only access we had was to documents in the courthouse that had been retained after your trial. And we went in there twice to go through boxes of stuff. And it seemed like the documents, I don't mean they were altered, but it seemed like it would change. What would come in the box would be different than what we saw before, 10, 20% difference.
But the point is, everything you asked for, we supplied you and we didn't hold anything back.
We had no feeling that anything was being kept from us or that we were being played, so to speak, to reach a certain determination. Not at all.
And in fact, you were just mentioning that the content of the boxes at the courthouse changed every time you went. But then there was also an incident where Mike Brown reached out to somebody in Albemarle County and tried to get you to back off the case, right?
There are a couple of things. I'll speak to that. I got a call from a former Albemarle sheriff that was before me. And he said he'd gotten a call from Sheriff Brown, and I don't want to call his name, but he wanted to know how well that he knew me. He said, well, I know him very well. I've known him 30 years. And according to what the former sheriff told me, is that Mike Brown wanted me to back off the case, that I was upsetting Ricky Gardner so much that he had to put him on vacation. And I asked that former sheriff, did he specifically use the term, could you see if you could get Harding to back off? And the former sheriff said, no, he didn't. But in law enforcement, we all know what we're saying. And in so many matter words, that's what he wanted. I had another incident where I don't want to identify this person either, but they were a member of Congress. And they came by my office and said they had just left from down in Bedford County. And put it in his words, they wanted to know what the hell I thought I was doing up here in Charlottesville. Well, I had a conference room off from my office that I'd set up, and everybody called it the war room because the walls were covered with stuff in your case and boxes of documents. I said, I'll show you what's going on. That was completely screwed up when he went to trial. Come here, let me show you. And he peeked in there and said, whoa, I'm having nothing to do with this. Turned and left my office.
I did not know about this incident. I know about the war room. But I did not know about this incident that a member of Congress had been asked to talk to you to back off, basically. And then he backed off when he saw how much time you'd spent on it.
I don't know. I can't tell you specifically if he was asked to, but he said they were kind of upset down there in Bedford and wanted to know what I was doing. Now, they may have asked him to come by and see me because he may have just done it on his own. And this congressional member himself had been a former prosecutor.
I understand you don't want to name his name, and that's perfectly fine. But the point here is that there was a good bit of pressure against you to stop investigating, even if it wasn't openly said. It was kind of, they let you know. Even without saying it, they let you know.
It's funny how law enforcement will circle the wagons. It's very difficult as you look into wrongful convictions to get anything from law enforcement. They circle the wagons and no one wants to own up that they made mistakes or misrepresented or screwed something up in an investigation.
Yeah. And that's, of course, a large part of the reasons why they only released me on parole and didn't grant me a pardon, because they circle the wagons and they don't want to admit a mistake was made, right?
That's true, and it also costs money when they exonerate you. Normally, the state of Virginia, the average payout's $50,000 a year. Michael Hash got $500,000. He was locked up for a little over 10 years. So you were there 33?
Right. It would have been $1.4 million that they did not have to pay me by not declaring me innocent.